I will record as well.
Sure.
Give me 1 second here. Yeah. Okay. Are we set to go?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So let me just share a screen with you. You can see it, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Excellent. Okay. So today, the entire session is devoted to bhakti, devotion. And let me begin with some preliminary remarks. So the first is that I'm going to do it in uh, a fashion that may not be entirely typical. Generally, what one would do, which is what I've done with most of the other subjects, is I have begun by giving you a broad overview and describe the nature of, if it happened to be a different phenomenon, I would usually have described the phenomenon and then let's say some of the major people associated with it. What I want to do in this case is that after speaking for just a few minutes, I'm going to go straight into one figure. We're going to look at him in detail. So your view of him is not colored by the general view of bhakti that I'm going to give you. So, and then I will uh, give a broad view of the entire movement, including an assessment of whether we should call it a movement at all. And then in the third part, as it were, and these parts are just informal, in the third part, look at a couple of figures in detail as well. All right. So that's
And today's a 3-hour lecture, right?
yeah, that's right. Yeah, yeah. And you'll be surprised how quickly it goes by.
Okay.
The material is very, very engaging. And this PowerPoint has been prepared specially for this session because I didn't actually have, there were a couple of slides which I had from before, but I've never done I mean, I've been studying this for a long time, but I've never done a full detailed course on it before because I've only offered some general observations on this to my undergraduate students in my Indian civilization class, where we spend, let's say 45, 50 minutes on the whole phenomenon. So this is a much more extended view of it. And in particular, a much more extended view of a few people, a few characters that I think are actually quite important. Uh, so that's one comment. The other is that needless to say, I mean, this is true of every other subject, but it's particularly true of the subject today, namely that each of these figures is really a major literary figure. A major literary figure, a major figure in the spiritual history of India, a major figure by some reckoning, at least if you look at, let's say, Kabir, Mirabai, Tulsidas. I mean, here we are speaking really of works that belong to world literature. Um,
Hmm.
and, and therefore, you're really speaking of people of the stature of the great, poets and writers from Europe, China, elsewhere. And therefore, each of these um, people, each of these poets are poets on whom we could lavish an enormous amount of time. And indeed, there is a considerable literature on some of them, though not all of them, and far less in many respects than what one might expect. But partly it has to do with the difficulty of working with material and those languages for some people, and the fact that this is, so-called devotional literature, and so many people, ordinary people, obviously simply view it as something that you sing to or sing along with, or you use as an aid in order to gain some apprehension, some understanding of the divine. And this literature that I'm really speaking about, I mean, much of this is really all poetry, and it's all sung. And so I would have you bear that in mind, that when we read it out or when we look at it in a scholarly fashion, that has its own implications. and the interpretations sometimes are interpretations which may not gel with what the common view of the matter is. All right. So I've called this the crown jewel of Indian spiritual literature, mindful of the fact that obviously we have such enormous works, which we have considered in the past, among them the Mahabharata, which again, doesn't have the same place in what we would call spiritual literature. I mean, it's obviously perhaps a supreme work of Indian literature. Some would argue, I mean, some would probably say that that's true of the Ramayana, but the Ramayana is a devotional text, as we had discussed, in a way in which the Mahabharata is not really a devotional text. So the Mahabharata doesn't generally figure in histories of spiritual literature in the same sense in which Bhakti is being invoked by myself here as a kind of spiritual literature. But why do I call it the crown jewel? Because if we take the Bhaktas together, and then we're really speaking of several dozen figures, of whom at least, let's say, 20 of them are really, really major figures. And then you have figures who perhaps in some ways are just as good, but whose works are lesser known, many works that have not really survived. Right? So there are all these kinds of considerations. But I hope that at the end of it, you'll have an adequate sense of why I think this literature is very important. The third remark has to do with what is called the Bhakti movement. Right? Now, this phrase is used often. A scholar who teaches at Barnard College, so that's the women's college at Columbia University, John Stratton Hawley, who's been a scholar of Bhakti for 40, 50 years, perhaps certainly 4 decades, and has worked extensively on some of the Bhakti poets, the Sagun poets. I'll explain that in just a few moments. But some of the poets he's worked on include Surdas and Mirabai. Someone like him has recently contested the usefulness of this category that I have invoked here, that is the idea of a Bhakti movement. Because, a movement very often suggests to people a concerted effort being made by a group of people. A movement may last for a very short period of time. It may last for, months. It may last for years. In this case, we're speaking about really a millennium. We're speaking about 10 centuries, maybe even a bit more. But that's not the main reason why he contests it. Also, why he contests the usefulness of this. He's not entirely jettisoning the category, entirely throwing it away.
Who are you referring to, Vinay?
I'm referring to Hawley, the scholar by the name of John.
Got it. The Bernard scholar. Got it.
Yeah, the Barnard scholar. Yeah. So he has he has questioned the utility of this category, but as I said, not simply because here we're speaking about a movement that is spread over, 1100, 1200, odd years. Because when you say that there is a movement, one thinks of, let's say, a movement over a very short period of time. As I said, sometimes a few months, maybe a few years. I mean, we can speak about the nationalist movement in India, and then we can, think of something that started, let's say, in the late 19th century and ended in 1947. Right? Let's say something that lasted 60, 70 years. Well, what does it mean to speak of a movement over a period of 10 centuries, 11th century, 12th centuries? But that's not the main argument. The main argument really, in a way, is that, this idea of a Bhakti movement as such was invented by Indian nationalists. And he looks in particular at the place of a couple of scholars closely allied to nationalism, who really looked at this vast corpus of literature and then in a way suggested that there had been a movement. And why did they think that it would be useful to speak of it? Because one of the things that the so-called Bhakti movement did was it presented us with some notion of India. All right. So if, for example, you look here, at this slide over here, you'll get a better sense of why the idea of the very idea of a bhakti movement is something that might possibly be contested. He's not contesting the fact that they're great devotional poets. He's just wondering aloud whether the idea of speaking of it as a movement really makes much sense. On the other hand, you might ask yourself, well, if we don't want to deploy that category, then how do we treat all of these people together, right? But should we treat them together? So if you look here, you'll get a very good sense, get a very good sense not only of how widely some of the major Bhaktas, so Bhaktas are the devotees, the great poets. I'm going to refer to them as Bhaktas, but a Bhakta can also be a common person. But here we're speaking of these great devotional poets that, they're dispersed throughout the country, as this map shows very clearly, correct? And he is not giving you every person of real consequence, who is now associated with this movement or is viewed as a great exponent of the idea of devotion. But if you look at it a little bit closely, you see that the origins of this are in the south, in the 9th century. Sometimes, if you take a more Sanskritic view, that is, that if you take the view of the great texts of Indian civilization, if we may call it that, then the earliest text, of course, would be the Bhagavad Gita. The Bhagavad Gita, right? The 2nd century of the Common Era, quite likely, maybe a bit earlier. We don't know exactly, as we've discussed before, when it was composed. We know the Mahabharata itself was composed over a period of several centuries. And we know that a portion of the Bhagavad Gita talks about the idea of bhakti, because what does Krishna, what are his teachings in the Gita? So his teachings to Arjuna are that there are different ways in which you can reach me. There are different ways in which you can reach the divine one, right? Different ways in which you can comprehend the idea of God. One is the path of knowledge, Gyan Yoga. Then there is the path of work, okay, Karma Yoga. So Gandhi, for example, is very often viewed as a karma yogi, although he's also a great devotee of Tulsidas in his own way. I mean, he can also be viewed as a bhakti yogi, right? Shankaracharya, whom I discussed at some length, was a person who advocated for Advaita, that is, for the path of knowledge here. Advaita, of course, is a particular school of Indian thought, as we've discussed before. So the Krishna here in the Bhagavad Gita says that the path of knowledge is a difficult one. It's only for the chosen few, for the elect few. Then you have the yoga of karma. Do whatever your duty commands you to do, and don't think of whether you will get the fruits of your action, right? In the action itself is the reward, so to speak, right? And then he says that for the mass of people, the easiest way to reach God is through the path of bhakti, the path of devotion, right? And so he says to Arjuna, be devoted to me, right? All right. So that there is a text there. Now, this map is not, when we are looking at these bhakti poets, what we are referring to is a different strand of literature, although the idea of bhakti goes back to the 2nd century. And then there is a work called the Bhagavata Purana, also known as the Bhagavatam, which is a text that originates from this part of India, South India, most likely Tamil Nadu, circa about 800. All right. What this map now is showing is really the dispersal of these poets. So here we have Nam Alvar, 9th century, and notice the trajectory. We move a little bit north and we get to Ramanuja, and we get to this person over here. And one of the things that you will notice when we look at a book called Speaking of Shiva, which is a collection of vachanas. Vachanas are poems, compositions, which were composed by what are called the Veda Shaiva poets. And we're talking about roughly 10th, 12th century. Many of those poets, except for Basavana, whom you see over here, are not even mentioned on this map. And so I reiterate that this map is only giving some major figures, not all of them by any stretch of the imagination. And then you see 12, so you've got Basavana, 12th century, early 1100s, basically, really, early 1100s. And then you see Namdev, so on the West Coast. So basically, the early Bhaktas are from South India. Then you start to get some of the great Bhaktas over here on the West Coast, Namdev and Naneshwar. And then you get poets coming in the 15th, 16th, 17th century. Meanwhile, it has spread to North and Central India over here, and you get some of these great poets over here, such as Kabir, Surdas, Ramananda, Tulsidas. Tulsidas we have encountered many times before, because recall that he is the author of the Ramcharitmanas, which is by far the most well-known version of the Ramayana story in North India, right? And we get people like Chaitanya over here in Bengal. And he doesn't mention, but we have actually a great number of great Shaiva poets. And we also have a woman by the name of Lalla. She goes by a number of names, but living from here, from the territory here in Kashmir. And then, of course, in the Punjab, we have Guru Nanak, whom we are not going to consider today, because we're going to really look at him when we move to the whole subject of Sikhism. So why did I show this map at this juncture? I haven't forgotten the point with which I started, namely that if we take all of these people as a whole, then do we have any way of speaking about them together?
Oh, sorry to interrupt.
Other than saying that they constitute part of a single movement. And then we say that this movement had several trajectories, but there's something common. And Hawley's argument is that, well, actually, it doesn't really serve much purpose to speak of a Nash Bhakti movement, because this idea really came into being during the period of Indian nationalism, when Indian literary figures were thinking about how the idea of a pan-Indian identity might be made attractive to Indians. Because, look at it this way, right? And then I'll pause and you can ask a question. Look at it this way. If you're a Bengali, you're in Eastern India, you're a Gujarati, you're in Western India, you're a Maharashtrian, from the Deccan here, from Western India, you're a Tamil speaker there. What is it that would animate all of them and many others to fight for something called the independence of India, right? It's a question that we have visited many times before. How do we imagine the idea of India? What is it that furnished India with some notion of an identity? So put very simply, for Hawley, the idea of a Bhakti movement may not have much scholarly merit, but the merit it may perhaps have is that it had a certain utility, because it helped Indian nationalists who were being aided by these literary scholars who said, hey, the Bhakti movement is one way in which we can think about how the unity of India was achieved. We can put this forward as an example to Indians who are thinking today about the possibility of the unity of India, the cultural, intellectual, spiritual unity of India. All right? Yeah, that's essentially one set of arguments having to do with the whole question of a Bhakti movement.
Okay. And so the Bhakti movement isn't just taking sort of a slice of Indian history and only talking about the devotional literature, or is it? We're talking about particular time periods, I guess, when it was very, very prolific.
Yeah, so the Bhakti movement is an idea. It's an idea that from about 800, roughly about the year 800 through, let's say, about the end of the 17th century, that in this period of time extending to over about 1 millennium, 1,000 odd years, during this period of time, there were these great devotional poets, itinerant. They're wandering from place to place. They're coming up with these great devotional compositions, and they are essentially furnishing India with a certain kind of cultural unity. All right, because these poets are fundamentally, okay, of two types, right? So one is people like Kabir and Nanak. Nanak is also the founder of Sikhism, right? And how are they demarcated? And Dadu over here, okay? How are they demarcated from most of the others? They're demarcated from most of the others because for them, God is formless. Nirgun. Gun is form, nir is without, formless. That is that God does not appear in the form of Krishna or Shiva or Durga, or right, is without form. In that sense, God is abstract. But abstract is not the right word, because God is not remote. God is very much personal to you, but there is no particular form he takes. There's no deity that you worship. All right. Then you have the great Bhaktas, the majority of whom are not nirgun, the majority of whom say that God appears to me in a personal form. God appears to me as Krishna. God appears to me as Vishnu, as Shiva. All right. So for example, Tulsidas, for him, who is the supreme God? Ram. The supreme God is Ram. He's a devotee of Ram. Surdas is a devotee of Krishna. But his Krishna, by the way, the Krishna he's interested in is not the Krishna that Mirabai here is this great poet that we're going to look at in some detail, because her bhajans are very popular, extremely popular all over North India. And many of the great classical singers have done renditions of them. All right. Now she is a devotee of Krishna too, but for her, Krishna is the lover. For Surdas, Krishna appears less so as a lover and appears more as Bal Krishna, as the child Krishna. So his compositions are all about the child Krishna. Okay. And then when you get to the Veera Shaiva poets here, such as Basavana over here, when you get to the Veera Shaiva poets, what we're really speaking about over here is a poet who's a Shaivite, So for him, God is Shiva. Shiva is the supreme God. Right? So this is the difference between the Nirgun poets and the Sagun poets. So this whole idea of a Bhakti movement, if we want to go along with that idea, which is fundamentally what has happened over a period of time, and I'm just saying that a scholar such as Hawley and some others as well would put into question whether this is a useful analytical category, because what it's really doing is it's bracketing a huge number of people who are actually in some respects quite different from each other. And although I think Hawley recognizes, as many others do, that there may be something that is common to all of these poets too. But the other problematic here is that we're really speaking about a vast expanse of time and space during which these people are writing. And so when we say a Bhakti movement, are we simply actually using a term that really, does it do good intellectual work for us, or does it actually do some disservice in that perhaps it furnishes some comprehension or idea of what was happening which may be inaccurate? And that would be obviously one of the questions that would be put about whether we can speak of a Bhakti movement. I think for your purposes, it would be useful to go along with the idea and say that yes, we can really think about the idea of bhakti, and we can say that it encompasses a large number of extraordinary poets writing in different languages. And yes, we can recognize that there were obviously some differences among them, but there's something that is really quite common. That something is what we will have to identify, and that would include some sense of passion, some sense of burning passion about the idea of God, that these are poets for whom God is a living presence. He burns within them, right? And they can't live without the idea of God. God obsesses them, takes over their lives. Right? That's what we're speaking of. And there's a
And
very recent anthology that has been published um, uh, with some good translations. Uh, it's called Eating God, Eating God, and it's a collection of bhakti poetry. All right, it's a collection of bhakti poetry with some very good translations. I will send that along as well. But it's very recent, only came out 2-3 years ago. And in this particular anthology, again, you see that all these poets and many others who are not mentioned in this map are all brought together. All right.
this, so did a lot of this happen during a particular narrow period? I'm seeing the periods here. So it's basically almost everything here is between, well,
No, no,
maybe 12,
it's
no?
not really that narrow, because you see here 9th century here at the bottom, Namalvar, and then you see Dadu 16th, 17th century. So that's the end of 1600, and actually we're really speaking about poets. We're speaking about. I mean, if you take, let's say, about 800 to 1650, that's about 850 years right there. All right. So now we're not really speaking about a narrow stretch of time. I think what you are referring to is the fact that a good number of them seem to be somewhere in the 15th, 16th century. Okay, that's and that may not be an inaccurate representation. It may not be, but there are really a very large number of poets. So as I said, for example, the poets that are referred to in a book called Speaking of Shiva, uh, which is a collection of the Veera Shaiva poets. This volume edited and translated by A.K. Ramanujan, one of the most famous books on Bhakti literature. This brings together a number of these Veera Shaiva poets. And these poets are essentially writing in the 10th, 11th, 12th centuries. All right, 10th, 11th, 12th centuries. He also has a collection of poets, the Alvar poets, whom we are not going to look at. And this collection is called Hymns for the Drowning. And this really goes back to poems written in the 9th century. So, circa 800, All right. So we are talking about a very substantial expanse of time over here. As I said, close to a millennium, really. Close to a millennium. And there's a serious question about whether one should even terminate the this idea of bhakti poetry with, let's say, 1600, 1700, or whether one can really think of people who belong to that strand of thinking but then come much later. So if you take someone like Ramkrishna Paramhans, the great Bengali saint, of course he doesn't write poetry. In fact, he doesn't write anything at all. But what he does is he gives discourses which are recorded by one of his disciples. And so and that collection is called the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, and that's circa 1900, right? But he would be a supreme example of a great bhakta in relatively modern times. All right. So some of the people that some of the principal exponents. This is a short list. Most of these people are mentioned in the map that you had really seen before. All right. Now, the way I wish to proceed, as I told you, is to start looking actually at one particular figure first. And then, because I want you to get a sense of, imagine that, very often when we read literature, what people are tempted to do usually. And they first want to read the biography of the person and then get a sense of, well, when was this book written? Where is it from? Get some background into the author. But imagine that, you were just given a text. And by the way, if you look, for example, at the writings of Basavana. So Basavana is this poet over here. Going back to the map here, we're going to look at him in some detail. 12th century, early 1100s is when he's born, maybe around 1110, 1115, something like that. We don't really have a date for him. But his compositions, how are they written? So they're all written on these manuscripts. And I don't read Kannada, but this is what Ramanujan talks about in his introduction to Speaking of Shiva, and it's been mentioned by many other scholars as well. They're written without these verses are written without any punctuation, without any paragraph break, right? Nothing of that kind at all. So you just have to know how to read a manuscript of that kind. There's no context, there's nothing, right? And that's
this is Kabir, or this is the book?
No, this is here I'm speaking of Basavana. I'm just giving you an example, because what I was trying to say here was that we're going to launch straight into someone like Kabir without giving you a whole history of what had preceded him, because I want you to get some sense. Imagine that you were reading a poet, and imagine that you were reading Basavana, and you were in the 13th, 14th century, you were reading him. You would just read the composition. You wouldn't be reading anything else, right? So sometimes a good intellectual exercise is to launch straight into a figure, not give too much of the background, and just see how much of the poetry of this person you can imbibe, right? What sense do you make of this person without really knowing too much of the context there? I'm giving you a little bit of the context, just so that you have some sense of who he is. Now, he's known as a Nergum poet. And Nergum is a term I've used before, right? So for him, God appears formless. He in many of his poems mentioned Ram, but this Ram has no relationship. Let us be very clear about this. Has no relationship to the Ram of the Ramayana. This Ram is simply his word for, let's say, Bhagwan, for God or for Allah. All right. And so Kabir is a Nirgun poet, where God appears to him formless, perhaps perhaps the greatest one alongside Nanak, the founder of Sikhism. His likely dates, because again, we cannot be entirely certain, are 1440 to 1518. There is another set of dates that has been given very often. Usually in those set of dates, he's born in 1398, and then dies, sometime in the sometime in the 1460s or thereabouts. But I think that these are more likely dates, the ones that are more often accepted. He's born in Jaunpur or Varanasi, somewhere in that area, and he dies in 1518 in a place called Magar, which is again in the vicinity of that area. Now, there are two different stories about his origins. The one story is that his parents abandoned him, that he had a Brahmin mother, and he's placed in a basket, and that basket is placed on the river, and then it's picked up by a Muslim family, and is adopted into this Muslim family. It's a family of a Julaha. Jula is a weaver. Okay. That's one family. And according to this, that's one story. And according to this version of the story, his parents were quite likely, they were I need to turn off my email here because that will disrupt us. So let me just quit. Yeah. Okay. So the likely story is that he was, that his parents were actually converts to Islam and had been recent converts, and that they might have been members of a sect before they converted called the Nath Yogis. One reason why this speculation has been made is that he doesn't seem to refer very often to Muslim practices too much in his writings, and therefore the suggestion is that he actually, even though he, according to this version, that he didn't really have an intimate familiarity with the practices of Islam. The more commonly accepted version um, of his origins is that he was actually born into a Muslim weaver's family, right? That's the more commonly accepted version, but that he acquired a Hindu ascetic and saint as his mentor, as his guru, by the name of Ramananda. Okay, that is, I think, the more commonly accepted version of it, and I think that no matter what the story of his origins, I think it's widely accepted that he was a disciple of the Hindu ascetic and saint Ramananda. Now, his compositions are known as um, uh, padas or pad. Uh, they're usually in many of the compositions are in rhymed couplets known as dohas, and sometimes they're known as shabdas. The word shabd means word in many Indian languages. And sometimes the compositions are also known as sakhis, witnesses. Right? Why witnesses? Because he is, in that sense, a witness to God. Right? The poems are also known as vanis, or utterances. Right? So when you read Kabir or the scholarly literature, you'll see a reference to all of these words. Uh, to some people, he is really a forerunner of Nanak, because Nanak was the other great Nirgun poet alongside Kabir, and um, Kabir predates him by some years. Uh, to Muslims, he is known mainly as a Sufi saint, a Sufi poet. To many Hindus, he is known as a Vaishnava, but not a Vaishnava in the sense in which clearly someone like Mirabai or Tulsidas or Surdas were Vaishnavas, right? Because these are poets who actually worship either Ram or Krishna, and Kabir, as we know, has he's a Nirgun poet, so he doesn't have a notion of a particular deity that he worships. There's a substantial number of works that are attributed to him. There's a very dense scholarship about what is the most authentic version of his compositions, because there are different recensions, as they're known. And so, without getting into that question, really, the principal works that you would be familiar with if you were, let's say, studying Kabir, would to some degree would be the Bijak, the Granthavali, the Kabir Granthavali, and there are also verses in the Guru Granth Sahib. So the Guru Granth Sahib is the holy book of the Sikhs, and there are verses by Kabir which are included in that. His followers are known as Kabir Panthis. He's had a substantial number of translators in the West, and one of the most common translations of Kabir into English was done by Rabindranath Tagore. Many of the poems that are included in the songs of Kabir that Rabindranath Tagore did are no longer viewed by many scholars as being authentically written by Kabir. They may have been written in Kabir's style, they may have been written by disciples of Kabir, and they get attributed to Kabir, but many of them may not have actually been by him. So there are all these kinds of questions. But I think that the scholarship now is sufficiently advanced that it has established with some degree of clarity what compositions can be attributed to Kabir, and what compositions which are thought to be by him are not really by him, but by people who were his disciples or people writing in the style of Kabir, uh, perhaps even decades or maybe even a century or two later. There's a fairly well-known American poet who has also done versions of Kabir. His name is Robert Bly. All right. So here's just a brief overview of Kabir himself. And here is a painting of Kabir. This dates from the early 19th century. And here you see him on the weaver's loom. He's because remember I said that he's a weaver. So this is perhaps, I think, the most common representation that we have of him. Usually he's shown bearded, but this painting in that sense is a fairly interesting painting of what Kabir may possibly have looked like, and the profession or the work that he pursued. So, what are his compositions?
You said he has followers.
Yes, followers, because these are people who accept him as a divine person, as someone who's you know a guru that they can look to for divine wisdom, So the Kabir Panthis, the Panth is the path or a way. So the Kabir Panthi is a sect which is takes its name after him, and the Kabir Panthi has several million followers. So these are people for whom Kabir is himself the divine one now. All right. And they call the Kabir Panthis. So you have actually a large number of uh, um, you know sects in India. Many people simply think of religious people as being either followers of Vishnu or followers of Shiva, but there are the Nath yogis that whom I had mentioned before. So you have this great figure called Gorakhnath, and Gorakhpur and UP, northern portion, not too far from the border with Nepal, is where Gorakhnath is said to come from, and where the Nath yogis are based. They're the Satnamis, who I'm not going to speak about. This is another religious sect. So you can have many. The Hinduism in that sense. I mean, if that is, one wants to call Kabir at all a Hindu poet, which I think many people will not. I mean, he is certainly an Indian poet, but would he be really called a Kabir? Would Kabir really be called a Hindu poet or not? I think the fact of the matter is that if you really look at common forms of Hinduism, and if you look, let's say, at Hindus, people who call themselves Hindus, and the kinds of religious compositions that they're familiar with, and that they really think of belonging to them, as it were, I think there are a huge number of Hindus who would fall into that category, and therefore would view Kabir as somebody who falls under the umbrella of Hinduism. But I think the scholarly view would be quite different. And I think that it's very important that we actually not make the mistake of viewing him as someone who belongs only to the Hindu community. In fact, his legacy has been constantly contested from the moment of his death. And you will see, if you're patient enough, in about 15 minutes, you'll see that Kabir is already anticipating, much of this. That is, that he's aware of the fact that they're Hindus, they're Muslims, and they're at odds with each other about many things. And one of the things they're certainly going to be at odds about is, well, who does Kabir really belong to? The Kabir Panthis really claim him as their own, and they don't identify either as Hindus or Muslims as such. All right. Okay. So, yeah.
So he's a weaver by profession.
Yes. Yeah.
But he's a guru that has followers. But his profession is that of weaving, so it's not like he's a full-time guru.
Yeah. You see, a lot of the Bhaktas are people with low caste origins. Not all of them, but a lot of them are low caste origins. They're cobblers, they're weavers, they're potters, right? They work in these professions. And your question is an important one, but if we view it in a very technical sense, we're going to run into difficulties. Let me explain. See, these people are fundamentally people who are itinerant, most of them. They move around from place to place, they sing, right? The idea of movement, we will see, has its own importance. So one of the fundamental contrasts in bhakti is between stagnant water and moving water. When you drink from a body of moving water, the water is fresh, right? And not only is it fresh, that as it moves along, it, so to speak, it sheds its impurities. In a body of stagnant water, the impurities will accumulate. All right. Now, when I say they're itinerant, I do mean it literally in the sense that many of them moved around from place to place. They wandered around. Right? They wandered around because they have a teaching. They have been called. They have received a certain kind of divine dispensation. They are obsessed, and they have to spread their teaching. Anyone follows it or not. But on the other hand, they all had, or the majority of them certainly had some kind of profession. Certainly the men did. The male bhaktas, many of them had a profession. In fact, Basava, the 12th century poet, was something like an accountant. And mind you, by the way, that even in modern times, it is not known to everyone, but some of the greatest poets were people who actually had very what you would call pedestrian professions. T.S. Eliot, one of the greatest poets of the English language in the 20th century, Nobel laureate, all of that, the man worked as a bank clerk for many years before he then became employed at Faber and Faber, which is a big publishing house in England, and became an editor there. Philip Larkin was a librarian. Wallace Stevens, a great American poet, was a doctor. Actually, he had an entire career as a doctor, and then he had a career as a poet. So there's no necessary contradiction there, right? When I say that he's a weaver, that he makes a living from there, and this is what I meant, that we could go on really about all of these things at very great length, because you see, this idea of working with your hands is very important. It's very important because the world is made by our hands, so to speak, and there is this idea that physical labor has its own kind of dignity. Okay, it has its own kind of dignity. So many things are contained in this notion of who the person is, if they happen to be, for example, a potter, a weaver, a cobbler, etc. So he comes from a family of julahas, weavers, and these people have their own traditions and so on. So now let's look at several of his compositions. And what I did was I'm taking 7 or 8 of them, the shorter ones, the dohas. So these are the couplets for the most part. And then we're going to look at some longer poems. And then we'll draw some general conclusions, right? So, and I sort of look at the theme, and then I put a kind of an idea to the theme. So here Kabir speaks of himself as someone who has taken the weight of the world on his shoulders and the price he has to pay, right? So when one of the poets, when one of the poems, he says, "Saints, I see the world is mad. If I tell the truth, they rush to beat me. If I lie, they trust me," right? That is that it's that if I actually lied, they would try. This is, I mean, it's really quite amazing. I mean, he's writing this, let's say sometime around 1480, something like that. He's really saying the world is topsy-turvy. If the lies are taken as truth, but if I actually speak the truth, they beat me, right? If I say that I have a divine vision, they'll say, "Oh, you're mad, you're mad." And so he says, look at this world. I mean, it's just going around its business, thinking that what it's doing is very important. What is this all about? right? He speaks of being persecuted. But let's look at the other doha, okay, in his own language, and you'll see the script as well in some of the other ones. Okay, sukhiya sab sansar, all right, khaye or soye. Sukhiya sab sansar, let's just break it down here. So oblivious to everything, this is implied. Sukhiya, sukh, happiness. Sansar is world, right? The world is happy, khaye or soye, eating and sleeping, right? Eating and sleeping. Dukhiya das Kabir. Dukhiya das Kabir, jage or roe. But the forlorn, the sad Kabir Das, Dasa, by the way, is a slave, a servant, right? So many of these poets, Sur Das, Tulsi Das, right? That word is ended at the word at the end because that person is a servant of God, right? The forlorn Kabir Das, jage or roe, right? The world is going around its business. People are eating and sleeping. It's my job to keep awake, and I weep looking at the condition of the world. But look at the composition. All right. So for one thing, it's rhymed, right? Soe, roe. So it rhymes at the end, right? And look at the alliteration. That is the same sound. So the first three words in the first line all begin with S. Sukhiya sab sansar. And then in the second one, Dukhiya Das, right? So you have the alliteration, you have the rhyming, and you see that the very composition lends itself to being sung. Now, I'm not a singer, right? But if I were a singer, and that's why you go to get some tapes and you listen to how it's sung, and it's very mellifluous, extremely. All right. And here what we're looking at is, we're going to be looking at two sets of compositions, if I may put it this way. I mean, that's not really the accurate way to put it, but one is where we're looking at his doha, and we're looking at some of the more well-known sayings that he has, okay? And the irony, because you see, this is the bhakta, this is the poet reflecting on a materialistic world, and looking at what's around him, people going around their business, doing this and that. And Kabir is thinking to himself, they're neglecting the only thing that matters. And what are they neglecting? They're really neglecting the fact that we have come to this earth in order to be able to attain spiritual liberation. All right. So here he says, बड़ा हुआ तो क्या हुआ, बड़ा हुआ तो क्या हुआ, जैसे पेड़ खजूर, पंक्ति को छाया नहीं, फल लगे अति दूर. It's exquisite. Okay. What is बड़ा हुआ तो क्या हुआ? So what if you are big, like the date tree, जैसे पेड़ खजूर? Okay. The date trees are huge, right? So what if you are big like the date tree? And then, panthi ko chaya nahi. This is a tree that gives no shade to a traveler. Fal lage ati dur, and its fruit is out of reach. Right? This is an allegory. It's an allegory about people who are rich and powerful and arrogant. They furnish no solace to ordinary human beings. Yes, they have a lot of wealth, but it's of no use to anyone else. Right? As simple as that. बड़ा हुआ तो क्या हुआ, जैसे पेड़ खजूर, पंथी को छाया नहीं, फल लगे अति दूर. Here's another composition. So I call this Kabir on the Art of Living and Dying. This is one of my very favorite ones. And there are different variations of it. But this is where he says, Kabira jab hum paida hue, jag hanse hum roe. All right, let's just pause with this line for a moment. All right. So Kabira jab hum paida hue. So here Kabir says, jab hum paida hue, when I was born, everyone, jug is the world, people. Hanse, hum roy, right? When a baby is born, the parents and all the relatives are delighted, they're beaming, they're smiling. There's one person who's crying. Who is that? That's the baby. It comes out crying, right? The rest of the world is happy. The baby is crying. ऐसी ऐसी करने कर चलो हम हंसे जग रोए. Lead your life in such a way that when you die, you should go out laughing, the world should be crying. I mean, it is just exquisite, right? Because he reverses it. That lead such an exemplary life where you show yourself. This is, in a way, it's like the teaching of the Gita, where you show yourself, I'm, you know, I've led the life I had to. I have led a life in accordance with certain norms of moral conduct, right? I'm a person of equanimity. Lead that kind of life. And then when you lead, the whole world should deplore your passing. They should be crying. You're smiling and laughing. The rest of the world is crying. But when you come into this earth, you are crying, everyone else is smiling. Right? So this is a doha. This is and again, you can notice that the rhymed, always here, in fact, is actually ending line both because the doha is a couplet, so he's ending both the first and the second lines with the same word, but it will generally almost always be with a rhymed word, even if it's not the same word. And of course, what he's doing here is he's essentially basically playing around. So if you look here at this, the last four words of this first line and the last four words, what he's really done there is it's the same four words. He's inverted the orders, right? So jag hase, the word smiles. Hamroy, we cry, I cry. And then in the second line, he inverts the order and creates a fantastic meaning out of it. Right? This was the artistry of Kabir. And there are variations of it. So there's an alternate ending, and there's a extraordinary work in Hindi that I've been reading quite recently, a history by Sundar Lal. I will refer to this much later on when I talk to you about British India. It's called Bharat Mein Angrezi Raj. So English rule in India. But before he gets into the English period, he gives you kind of a synopsis, right? He gives you a synopsis of what was happening in India before. And he has this particular line as well. And there is a little variation. So his volume 1, page 60, he says, "Jab tu ayo jagat mein, jagat hanse tu roy." Okay, ab to aisi, ab. So jab and up. So this is where we have recensions. That is, we have we have different variations, and so we don't know which is probably the most authentic text. And it's not clear that there was really an authentic text, because the meaning is very clear, and these are compositions. Kabir would have sung them, and sometimes he might have sung them in 2 or 3 different ways, 4 or 5 different ways, right? So in the second line, jab tu aisi kar chalo, tu hanse jag roy, right? Okay, and these, by the way, so Kabir, the language here is what we would call Hindi, but Hindi of that time is a very complicated story, as I tried to suggest to before. Includes elements of what are called Braj, in particular for this time. And when we get to Mirabai, we see Rajasthani. When we're looking at poets, in the Gangetic Plain. We might see Awadhi, Hindi, Rajasthani, um, a mix, but all related, all related. All right. Now here's another composition over here. Kabir on so what I call on everything in its own sweet time. Um, so what he's saying over here is धीरे धीरे रे मना धीरे सब कुछ होए. Okay, धीरे धीरे रे मना, slowly slowly, oh mind, धीरे सब कुछ होए, everything happens in its own time, right? Mali sinche so ghada, and I'll translate that, ritu ay fal hoye. All right. Mali sinche so ghada, the gardener may water with 100 buckets, but the fruit will only come in its own season. Everything in its own place, everything in its own sweet time. One of the many things one of the many ways in which you can interpret this, because then you say to yourself, all right, it sounds fantastic. How do we really interpret a poem of this kind, right? A very simple but elegant and exquisite composition. One is that we have to think about the whole question of what is the nature of human agency. We think we are acting on things all the time. It's in our will to act on things. We try to influence the course of events. Right? And Kabir is saying, well, we should be a little mindful of whether that's really the case. This is, of course, the kind of teaching that many religious traditions have offered. Right? He's also adding a number of different things. Things happen in their own time. This is an admonition, by the way, also to slow down. Right? I mean, what was the disease of modern civilization as Gandhi analyzed it in Hind Swaraj? Speed. And he's writing in 1909. Now we're talking about 2020, where speed is everything. Right? The whole intent of creating faster and faster computers and having all other aids to technology is to speed up things and to make us into multitasking monsters so that we are able to do 5 or 6 things together at the same time. Well, why should we be doing all of that? That's one of the things that, if you were doing, let's say, a very modern reading of this, right? Things happen in their own time. The gardener may water with 100 buckets. Right? But fruit will come its own season. And of course, one of the whole impulses of modernity is to defy that. Right? So therefore, if you're living in California as I am, well, the whole idea is that you should be able to have avocados throughout the year. You should be able to have broccoli throughout the year. You should be able to have anything you want throughout the year. Right? But he's speaking about a different notion of temporality. He's speaking also about being at peace with oneself, a number of different things. All right. So the futility of worrying. All of these are really marvelous. Just notice the composition. Very short, 2 lines, that's all. Right? And of course, I mean, and the language lends itself to that, right? Because you have when you do the translation, you have to sort of fill it a little bit. Chinta aisi dakni, kaat kaleja khaye, वैद बिचारा क्या करे, कहाँ तक दवा लगाए. Chinta ऐसे, right? Dakini, dacoit. By this Dakini, the word dacoit. You know who a dacoit is, right? A dacoit is a person. Dacoits are those who, commit theft, and usually robbery. So dacoity. So people who raided other people's homes and would take their wealth, they were called dacoits. So he says, such a dacoit is like a dacoit. Kaat kaleja khaye, eats away at the heart. It eats away at the heart. Vaid bichara kya kare? Vaid is doctor. That's the old Sanskritic word for a doctor. The poor doctor, what can he do? How far can he heal? There is no cure for anxiety. There is no cure for needless worry. And one of the reasons we needlessly worry is because if we are too immersed in the material life, then we are always thinking about how do I make my next 5,000 rupees, right? How do I, how do I become a bigger man? How do I become more important than I already am? This constant worry, we are caught in a web of obligations. What the bhakta here is saying is, we're caught in this web of obligations in this world. And the implication is that the only real obligation that matters is the one that we will ignore. And that's the obligation, so to speak, to look within oneself and to find the guru, the God within oneself. Right? Pothi padi padi jag mua, pandit bhaya na khoe, ढाई आकर प्रेम का पेड़ सो पंडित होए, पढ़े सो पंडित होए. Okay, so here he says pothi. Pothi is the word for books. Okay, pothi padi padi jag mua, pandit bhaya na koe. No scholar was ever made from reading countless number of books. Dhai akar, dhai is 1.5 literally, so that's why between 1 and 2, akar prem ka, but one who knows a thing or two about love. And here he doesn't mean, of course, sexual love. He's talking about the love for the divine, right? With other possibilities of filling out that word, which would include love for your neighbor, love for others, love for humanity, all of that, right? But one who knows a thing or two about love, he is greater than the learned man. Now, I have to add over here, and that's why I added this little poem, that there's a tradition of mocking scholars. Very often comes from those who this particular kind of tradition of mocking scholars comes from those who believe that to apprehend the divine, to become one with God, you don't need to have bookish learning and all of that. And that very often what this bookish learning does is it actually clouds your vision. So, there are distinctions that are made between people who are learned but who may not be wise. And there are lots of people who may be wise but who are not learned. And so W.B. Yeats, another, I referred to T.S. Eliot in a few moments ago, but W.B. Yeats, another great poet, Irish poet, writes a poem called The Scholars. The first stanza of which is, bald heads forgetful of their sins, oh learned, respectable bald heads, edit and annotate the lines that young men tossing on their beds rhymed out in love's despair to flatter beauty's ignorant ear. So, the work of scholars is they take poems that have been published by these young men, and then these scholars try to interpret them, try to edit them, annotate them. And so he set up a contrast between those who, in a sense, know love in the flesh and those who only know love through the books, right? Much as what Kabir is talking about, knowing love in the flesh. But here he doesn't mean sexual love, but really knowing love in the flesh means experiencing it, visceral experience of it, that, when you have experienced God, you get goosebumps, right? And only knowing God through books. That's the contrast that he's setting up over here, right? What does he say about the seductions of the ego? Why is all of this important for the bhakta, for the poet? It's important because the ego is what prevents you from reaching God, the divine one, right? So here Kabir says, Maya taje to kya hua, man taja na jaye. मान बड़े मुनिवर गए, मान सबन को खाए. Right? Maya taje to kya hua? First part. So what if one gives up one's wealth? Right? Yeah. So let's take a view here for a moment. You will recall this from 6-7 months ago. So in Suketu Mehta's book, which I think you've read, Maximum City. So on Mumbai, right? So there's a scene almost at the very end where he talks about this wealthy Gujarati Jain merchant, extremely wealthy man who gives up all his wealth, and then you're supposed to do that, right? In the tradition, and then you go and you actually beg for your food. So man has given up his wealth, but Kabir would say, not necessarily my view. Kabir would say, well, hard as that seems, even giving up that wealth is actually quite easy in comparison to giving up one's ego. Man taja na jaye. Maya taje to kya hua? All right, you've given up. Maya is illusion, right? Ignorance, wealth. All three translations will work. Maya taje to kya hua? So what if you gave up your wealth? Man taja na jaye. Giving up one's ego is not so easy. Man bade muni var gaye. Muni var gaye. Muni is the wise man here. Many wise men have fallen to the ego. Man saban ko khaye. The ego consumes one and all. Right? That's what I'm calling on the seductions of the ego. So those are the dohas. Now we're going to move to 2 or 3 other poems by Kabir. But here, what I've done, I've taken something from Linda Hess's translation of the Bijak. So Linda Hess is an American scholar who's worked on Kabir. She's a renowned Kabir scholar, has been working on Kabir for many years. And she put together a very beautiful translation of the Bijak. So it's called Kabir's Bijak, about 3 or 4 decades ago. And what she did simply here was she took the first lines or first 2-3 lines from many of the poems as she translated them, just to indicate to us, to the reader, what is the tenor of his writing. Because now we're going to look at a different tenor of his writing. So we looked at the dohas, now we're going to look at the longer compositions. And we're looking at the first few lines of many of these compositions, and then we look at the couple of the compositions in detail. Because in these longer compositions, and many of them, what he's going to do is he's going to mock both the Hindus and the Muslims. All right. And for a moment, just, go along, because you might think to yourself, all right, why is he doing that? So that's where I'm going to then go back after I finish with Kabir, and I'm going to give you the larger background. So now, what is this movement really about? What are these poets really talking about?
You said why he's doing what? Sorry?
Why is he mocking the Pandits? Why is he mocking the Muslims? Right? So Pandit, you've got it wrong. Monk, stop scattering your mind. These are lines. Very often the first line, sometimes in the middle of a poem. These are different lines from different poems that have been put together in a little collage. So you can sense a tone, right? He's got this mocking tone, sharp, mocking, ironical tone. Pandit, you've got it wrong. Pandit, do some research and let me know how to destroy transiency. Now you, Mr. Qazi, you know who a Qazi is? Qazi is a Muslim theologian or lawyer. All right. Okay. So a mullah is usually the Muslim priest. Maulvi is the priest. Right? And then Qazi is very often is the word that is really used for the Muslim legal scholar. Okay, but sometimes used for the theologian as well in a broader way. Right? Now you, Mr. Qazi, what kind of work is that, going from house to house, chopping heads? Who told you to swing the knife? Because the Qazi is always adjudicating things, saying, I know what is permitted and what is not permitted. Right? Pandit, think before you drink that water. You know what this is, right? This is, hey, the man is about to drink the water. But what if a Shudra had drunk from that water before? So he's mocking the Pandit, saying, yeah, because you have all these laws of purity, impurity. So he's mocking him, right? Think, figure it out. Morons and mindless fools. He very often addresses these Brahmins and these Muslim mullahs and qazis with these words, right? Look in your heart. You've got all these books, but look inside yourself, you simple-minded people. These are lines from some of his compositions. So now let's look at one of these longer poems. Qazi, what book are you lecturing on? Right? What is this book that you're lecturing on? I mean, and is it the Quran? Is it the Hadith? You're always reading a book. You're always got a book and saying, let me consult the book before I see whether this is permitted or not. Yak, 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 day and night. You never had an original thought. Feeling your power, you circumcise. Feeling your power, you circumcise. Because how do you distinguish a Muslim male in India from a Hindu, a Sikh, if you did not have the outward symbols of the faith? How would you distinguish the Muslim from the Jain, the Hindu, and the Sikh? Say the Sikh was not wearing his turban, all right? Say the Hindu did not have his sacred thread. Right? How would you know? It's a circumcision, right? Feeling your power, you circumcise. I can't go along with that, brother, he says. If your God favored circumcision, why didn't you come out cut? Well, if God really wanted circumcision, you should have been born circumcised. Maybe God didn't want circumcision, he's saying. If circumcision makes you a Muslim, what do you call your women? And then how about, so here he's saying, it's a very interesting observation, because what he's saying here is that, it's always the symbols of the faith borne by the men by which we distinguish adherents of the faith, right? Circumcision is for men. The turban is for Sikh men. So don't women count at all? Right? What do you call your women? Since women are called man's other half, you might as well be Hindus. And here I want to pause for a second and say that there are feminists who have actually said that they find Kabir to be just as paternalistic and misogynist. So there's a bit of a discussion in feminist circles whether, yes, okay, Kabir was very progressive in many ways, but was he progressive about his thinking with respect to women? Did he fall into that patriarchal idea that, well, women, they basically tempt men, and for that reason they always have to be kept, at a distance, right? So there's a question there which we're not going to address, because that would mean then really going deep into Kabir scholarship, right? We're looking at the general tenor of what Kabir really stands for over here. But in this poem, at least, he's sensitive to the fact that when you're looking at this whole idea of who is a Muslim, who is a Hindu, well, it always seems to be the men by which you, in a way, define the religion, not the women. Okay. If now he reverses it, because he's attacked the Muslims there now, then he says, if putting on the thread makes you Brahmin, what does the wife put on? Right? Because the thread ceremony is only for men. It's not for women. That Shudra's touching your food, Pandit. Hey, watch it, Pandit. Do you know who's not that Kabir believes himself. He's mocking him. He's saying that, you are the guys who observe all of these laws of purity. You're the ones who are obsessed with the idea that you might get contaminated by the presence of a Dalit, of a Shudra. Of course, he's not going to use the word Dalit. That's not the word that was used at that time. Shudra. That Shudra's touching your food, Pandit. How can you eat it? Hindu, Muslim, where did they come from? Right? Who's a Hindu? Who's a Muslim? When did it all begin? Who started this road? Look hard in your heart. Send out scouts. Where is heaven? Does heaven know the distinction between a Hindu, a Muslim, a Jain, a Sikh. Now you go your way by force, but when it's time for dying without Ram's refuge, says Kabir, brother, you'll go out crying. And here the Ram is not the Ram of the Ramayana. Ram here is the transcendent one, the formless one, right? The divine one. Okay. Pandit, look in your heart for knowledge. So these numbers at the top, 41, that refers to the number of the composition in the book, in the Bijak, right? Pandit, look in your heart, because these are not titled, the poems are not titled. Pandit, look in your heart for knowledge. Tell me where untouchability came from, since you believe in it. Makes red juice, white juice, and air, a body bakes in a body. This is a bit obscure. That's why there's a little note here. Okay, so which I didn't include here, because that's what the scholars will do, is they'll try to figure out, well, what does really Kabir mean by these particular, these verses over here, right? As soon as the 8 lotuses are ready, it comes into the world. Then what's untouchable? 400,000 vessels decay into dust, while the potter keeps slapping clay on the wheel, and with a touch cuts each one off. Here he is describing really the cycle of nature. We eat by touching. We wash by touching. From a touch, the world was born. And this is the phenomenology of touch, the supreme importance of touch. And that's why when I wrote my book on the coronavirus this summer, I mean, I have a whole little discussion of touching, because what is it that we are not called upon to do? All of us, wherever we are in the world, we are called upon not to touch someone else. Keep a distance of 6 feet, social distancing. But how important is touch to humanity, to the very idea of being human, the essence of touch? What happens when a person is deprived of touch? You see, Kabir is saying here, what is this idea of untouchability? You can't touch, you can't be close to that other person, to that Shudra. You can't touch the food he's touched, because you'll get polluted, you'll get contaminated. But Kabir is saying, how central is touch? Think of it. We eat by touching. We wash by touching. From a touch, the world was born. So who's untouched? Asked Kabir. And he says there's only one person who's untouched. And that is the person who has no taint of Maya. Maya, illusion, ignorance. Only that person really is the untouched one. Yeah. So this is what Kabir is. His death in Benares won't save the assassin from certain hell, any more than a dip in the Ganges will send frogs or you to paradise. So let's go back to the first. His death in Benares won't save the assassin from certain hell. You know what he's referring to here? He's referring to the Hindu idea that if you die in a place such as Benares or Varanasi, which is a place that Kabir knew very well because he was born in that area, right? And his final resting place is that area. And you know that there are 2 temples in Varanasi to Kabir. One is the temple run by the Hindus, the other is run by the Muslims. Because as I said to you, they both have their own competing sort of claims on Kabir. But the Hindu idea that if you die in Benares, you will gain eternal merit. All your sins will be washed. So Kabir says, this is a very modern translation by a different translator. And that's why I thought I would end the section on Kabir with that. His death in Benares won't save the assassin from certain hell, he says, any more than a dip in the Ganges will send frogs or you to paradise. Just don't think that if you take a dip in the Ganga, you will have all your sins washed. My home, says Kabir, is where there's no day, no night, and no holy book in sight. to squat on our lives. Right? So this is a poem translated by Arvind Krishna Mehrotra. It's a much more modern translator. He's a very good translator and a poet in his own right as well. Right? I think that this is the last of what I have on Kabir. So before I go on to the more general